Welcome, dear dreamer. Tonight, we journey to a kingdom in the shadow of a mighty mountain. Mount Etna, once silent, has awakened with fire and whispers of an ancient witch. A brave knight named Thorne steps forward, joined by Valen, the wise wizard, and Elyse, the keen-eyed archer. Together, they travel through lands of ash and flame, uncover secrets of the past, and face the fire witch whose power threatens the world. In their struggle, courage, sacrifice, and hope shine brighter than the fire itself. Now, let the quiet night carry you into this tale of wonder and rest. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke, a foreboding veil that drifted over the kingdom, nestled in the shadow of Mount Etna. Ashes fell from the sky like a gentle snowfall, though nothing about this omen was gentle. Farmers left their fields untended, artisans abandoned their craft, and traders hurried through the streets with their goods, eyes flickering upward with nervous glances toward the distant, fiery peak. Mount Etna had always been a part of the kingdom's landscape, a sleeping giant whose distant grumbles were more legend than threat. But now, whispers traveled faster than any fire, spreading fear throughout the land. The flames licking at the mountainside were not born of nature. They spoke of something darker, more sinister. In the court of King Aemond, such rumors could not be ignored. The great hall, once a place of laughter and light, now echoed with the murmur of anxious courtiers and advisors. At the center of it all, the king himself sat upon his throne, brow furrowed in deep concern. His once vibrant eyes, now dimmed with worry, scanned the room for answers, though none could offer the solution he sought. It was then that the doors of the hall were flung open with a gust of warm wind. A messenger, soot-streaked and trembling, staggered forward, his eyes wide with terror. Clutched in his hand was a scroll, sealed with a mark that no one had seen in generations, an ancient sigil, long believed to be nothing more than a myth, the mark of the fire witch. "Your Majesty," the messenger gasped, falling to his knees before the king. "It is true. She has returned. The fire witch of Mount Etna sends her demands." A murmur of shock rippled through the court. The fire witch was a name from the darkest chapters of their history, a sorceress whose mastery of fire had once threatened to consume the kingdom in a blaze of wrath. The story said she had been banished, sealed within the heart of the mountain by a powerful magic. That she could return now after centuries was unthinkable. "Speak, man," King Aemond commanded, his voice steady, though his knuckles whitened against the armrests of his throne. The messenger, hands trembling, unfurled the scroll. "The witch demands the return of the royal scepter," he read, his voice cracking. "The very scepter that your ancestors took from her to imprison her within the mountain. If it is not returned within the fortnight, she will unleash the fury of Mount Etna upon the kingdom, and all will be consumed in fire." A silence, thick and oppressive, filled the hall. Courtiers exchanged nervous glances, and advisors whispered frantically among themselves. The scepter in question was no ordinary artifact. It was a relic of immense magical power, one that had been passed down through the royal line for generations. To give it up would be to surrender the kingdom's most treasured defense, but to refuse was to risk destruction. King Aemond's face hardened as he rose from his throne, his voice echoing through the hall. "We will not bow to the whims of an ancient witch. We will not surrender our kingdom's power to her threats." "But your Majesty," an advisor spoke up cautiously, "if she truly holds the power to awaken the mountain, then we must stop her before she can act." The king replied, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We need a champion, someone brave enough to face the Fire Witch and end this threat once and for all. A murmur of hesitation followed his words. Many of the kingdom's bravest knights had fallen in distant wars, and those who remained were uncertain, unsure of how to combat a foe of such legend and power. It was a mission that seemed as impossible as it was perilous. But then, amidst the uncertainty, a figure stepped forward, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in the dark armor of a seasoned warrior. Sir Thorne's presence commanded the attention of the room. His weathered face, lined with the marks of battle, showed no fear as he bowed before the king. "I will face the Fire Witch," Thorne declared, his voice steady and unwavering. "Let me be the one to stop her and save the kingdom from her wrath." King Aemond's eyes narrowed, measuring the knight who had served him so faithfully for years. "You understand the danger of what you propose, Sir Thorne? The Fire Witch is no mortal enemy." "I understand," Thorne replied, his gaze flickering toward the distant mountain visible through the great hall's windows. "But I have faced fire before. This time, I will not let it consume what I swore to protect." The king studied him for a moment longer before nodding. "Then go, and may the gods be with you." As Thorne turned to leave the hall, his heart was as heavy as the sword at his side. The journey ahead would be long and dangerous, but he would not fail. He could not, for in the flames of Mount Etna, a greater battle was waiting. A battle not just for the kingdom, but for his very soul. The court's murmurs of approval and doubt echoed behind Sir Thorne as he stepped out of the great hall and into the cool evening air. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, though his expression remained impassive. The fires of Mount Etna flickered on the horizon like a watchful, malevolent eye, as if the mountain itself sensed the task that lay before him. Thorne strode through the castle grounds, his mind already racing with plans. He knew the Fire Witch was no ordinary foe. Legends of her power were woven into the very fabric of the kingdom's history. Stories told to frighten children and to remind warriors that there were forces even steel could not conquer. But those tales had never discouraged Thorne. He had fought in battles where the odds were grim, had faced foes thought invincible, and had lived to tell the tale. This would be no different. Yet, there was something else driving him now, something deeper than duty to the crown. A memory, unbidden, rose from the recesses of his mind. Flames, roaring flames that consumed his childhood home, leaving nothing but ash and ruin. His family, his life, everything he had known, taken in a single night by a fire that no one could explain. It was said to be the work of vengeful spirits, but Thorne had long suspected otherwise. He had seen fire before. He had heard the crackle of unnatural flames, much like those now burning across the kingdom's villages. He pushed the thought aside. Now was not the time for memories. He needed to gather his companions for the journey ahead, for this was not a task one man could accomplish alone. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in a deep purple hue, Thorne had made his way to the wizard Valen's tower. The ancient structure stood apart from the rest of the castle, its stone walls covered in vines and runes, glowing faintly in the dark. Valen was one of the last true wizards of the realm, a man of knowledge and power, though his appearance suggested otherwise. Tall and lean, with silver hair tied back in a simple braid, he looked more like a scholar than a wielder of ancient magic. When Thorne entered the tower, he found the wizard poring over a dusty tome, his eyes flicking up in acknowledgement. "So, it is true," Valen said without preamble. "The Fire Witch has returned." Thorne nodded. "And I need your help to stop her." Valen closed the book with a soft thud and rose to his feet. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Thorne's, searching for something. You understand what you're asking, do you not? The Fire Witch is no mortal threat. Her power comes from the very core of the mountain itself. Even I have heard tales of her flames so fierce it consumes the soul as easily as it does flesh. I understand, Thorne replied, his voice steady. But I won't be alone. With your magic and Elyse's skill, we can stop her before the volcano awakens. At the mention of Elyse, Valen raised an eyebrow. The archer? You intend to drag her into this madness? She's already volunteered, Thorne lied, knowing full well Elyse had yet to hear of his plan. But there was no doubt in his mind she would come. They had fought side by side for years, their friendship forged in the heat of battle. She had never turned her back on him, and he would not ask her to now. Valen studied him for a moment longer before nodding. Very well, I will accompany you, but know this. Fire is a force of nature. It cannot be reasoned with or tamed. The Fire Witch has harnessed a power that even the gods once feared. If we are to defeat her, it will not be through strength alone. You must be prepared to face more than just flames. Thorne nodded grimly. I'm ready. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the castle walls, Thorne stood waiting at the gates of the keep, his armor, polished but scarred from battles long past, gleamed faintly in the pale sunlight. By his side was Valen, his staff in hand, the air around him humming softly with the magic that always seemed to linger in his presence. They didn't wait long. The sound of hooves on stone echoed through the courtyard as Elyse rode up to meet them, her bow slung across her back and her expression one of cool determination. Her sharp eyes, framed by her loose auburn hair, met Thorne's with a silent question. You've heard the king's call? Thorne asked as she dismounted. I've heard, she replied, and you already know my answer. Thorne smiled faintly. Of course he did. There was no other archer in the kingdom who could match her skill. No one else he would trust to watch his back in the heat of battle. Then we ride, Thorne said, his voice carrying a weight of finality. Mount Etna awaits. As they set off toward the distant mountain, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble, as if the earth itself was warning them of the fire that would soon come. And in the distance, the glow of Etna's flames grew brighter. The journey toward Mount Etna was long and grueling, a path of charred earth and smoldering ruins that seemed to stretch on without end. As Sir Thorne, Valen, and Elyse rode through the desolate countryside, the signs of the Fire Witch's wrath became more apparent with every passing mile. What once had been fertile farmland was now a landscape of scorched trees and blackened soil. Even the air was thick with the acrid stench of burning, making it difficult to breathe. Thorne's eyes scanned the horizon, his senses on high alert for any signs of danger. The closer they came to the volcano, the more the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet, as if the earth itself was warning them to turn back. But there was no turning back now. Each step forward was a step deeper into the heart of the inferno. It wasn't long before they came across the remnants of a village, now nothing more than a collection of charred huts and smoldering embers. The heat was unbearable, even from a distance. And as they approached, the devastation became clear. Entire homes had been reduced to ash, and what little remained of the village was a ruin of twisted beams and blackened stone. Elyse dismounted first, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the destruction. This was no ordinary fire, she muttered, kneeling down to sift through the ashes. The flames, they didn't just burn, they consumed everything, even the stone. Valen nodded grimly, his staff glowing faintly as he reached out to sense the lingering magic. "These are the fires of Etna itself," he said, his voice low and filled with foreboding. "The fire witch draws her power from the mountain. The closer we get, the stronger she becomes." Thorne clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he looked around the ruined village. The people who had lived here, who had worked this land, were gone. No trace of life remained, only the echoes of their terror and pain. He had seen the aftermath of battle many times before, but this was different. There were no enemies to fight, no army to vanquish, only the unrelenting power of fire, wielded by a woman who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. "We have to move quickly," Thorne said, his voice hardening with resolve. "Every moment we delay, more lives are lost." Elyse stood and brushed the ash from her hands. "Agreed, but we need to be careful. If the fire witch has eyes on us, she'll strike before we're ready." Valen glanced toward the distant peak of Mount Etna, where plumes of smoke curled into the sky, dark and ominous. "She already knows we're coming," he said. "I can feel it. Her magic is in the air, watching us, waiting." Without another word, they pressed on, their path leading them ever closer to the looming volcano. The air grew hotter with each step, and the ground beneath their feet became unstable, as if the very earth was alive with the same fiery energy that fed the witch's power. Rivers of molten rock flowed down the mountainside, glowing like veins of liquid fire, and the sky above was choked with ash and smoke, turning the day into a dim twilight. It was as if they were entering another world, a world where fire ruled and nothing else could survive. As night fell, the group made camp on a small plateau overlooking the molten landscape below. There was no wood to be found for a fire, not that they needed it. Mount Etna provided all the light and heat they could ever want. The glow of the molten rivers cast flickering shadows across the ground, giving the land an otherworldly appearance. Thorne sat a short distance from the camp, his sword laid across his lap as he sharpened its edge with slow, deliberate strokes. His thoughts were consumed with the task ahead, the enormity of what they faced. The fire witch was not just a foe to be vanquished. She was a force of nature, an embodiment of the mountain's fury. To defeat her would take more than steel and bravery. Valen, seated nearby, watched him with a thoughtful expression. "You carry a heavy burden, Sir Thorne," the wizard said quietly. "I sense more than just duty in your heart." Thorne paused, his hand stilling on the blade. "It's not just about the kingdom," he admitted, his voice low. "Years ago, I lost my family to a fire that burned hotter than any should. I never understood what caused it, but now I can't help but wonder if it was her, if the fire witch has been behind this destruction for longer than we know." Valen nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Fire leaves scars that are not easily healed," he said. "But remember, Thorne, vengeance and justice are not the same. When we face the fire witch, you must keep your purpose clear." Thorne met the wizard's gaze, his resolve hardening. "I know my purpose," he said, "and I will see it through." Elyse returned from scouting the area, her expression grim. "We're not alone out here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw movement in the shadows, figures watching us. We need to be ready. The fire witch isn't going to wait for us to reach her." Thorne stood, his sword gleaming in the firelight. "Let her come," he said, his voice steely with determination. "We'll be ready." The dawn broke with a pale, fiery glow that mirrored the seething heart of Mount Etna. The air was heavy, laden with the oppressive heat that radiated from the volcano, and a faint tremor rippled through the earth beneath their feet. Thorne, Valen, and Elyse pressed on, their path winding through a desolate valley where the stone itself was blackened and cracked, as though the land had once been scorched by the touch of the fire witch's flames. It was on the second day of their journey through this inhospitable terrain that they stumbled upon something unexpected. A cave, hidden in the shadows of a jagged cliff. Its entrance was narrow, nearly invisible against the charred rock. But Valen's sharp eyes caught sight of the faint markings etched around the opening. "This isn't natural," Valen muttered, kneeling to examine the symbols carved into the stone. His fingertips traced the ancient runes, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These markings are wards, protective sigils. Someone sealed this place long ago." Thorne and Elyse exchanged a glance. "A tomb?" Elyse asked, her voice low, as though the very air around them demanded reverence. Valen shook his head. "Number something else." He rose, his expression thoughtful. Whatever lies within was meant to be hidden, not from men, but from the fire witch herself. Thorne's grip tightened on the hilt of his sword. "Then we're going inside." The cave's interior was cool, a welcome relief from the oppressive heat outside. But there was something else about the place, an ancient power that seemed to hum just beneath the surface, like the quiet pulse of forgotten magic. The walls were lined with old carvings, telling stories of battles fought long ago, of kingdoms lost and kingdoms born again. And at the very heart of the cave, they found it, a library, its shelves filled with crumbling tomes and scrolls coated in layers of dust. Valen's eyes gleamed with excitement as he rushed toward the shelves, his fingers brushing over the spines of the ancient texts. "This is it," he breathed. "The knowledge we need." Thorne remained at the entrance, his instincts alert. "What knowledge?" "The truth of the fire witch," Valen said, pulling a heavy tome from the shelf. He opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age, and began to read. Isolde, that was her name. Before she became the fire witch, she was known as Isolde, a sorceress of great power. But she wasn't always like this. Elyse, standing nearby, leaned in to peer at the pages. "What happened to her?" Valen's brow furrowed as he scanned the text. She sought to master the element of fire, not to destroy, but to protect. She believed that by controlling the flames, she could defend her people from the threats that plagued the land. But something went wrong. The fire, it consumed her, it changed her, and when her power grew too great, the kingdom's rulers feared her. They took her scepter, the source of her magic, and used it to bind her within the mountain. Thorne's heart pounded in his chest as the truth began to sink in. "The scepter," he murmured, his gaze distant. "The one she's demanding now. It was hers all along." Valen nodded grimly. "Yes, and it holds the key to her power. With it, she could control the fire of the volcano itself. But without it, she is still bound to Mount Etna, unable to fully unleash her fury." Thorne's mind raced. The scepter wasn't just an artifact of power. It was the one thing keeping the fire witch imprisoned within the mountain. If she regained it, she would have control over the volcano, and nothing would stop her from drowning the kingdom in fire and ash. Elise's voice broke the silence. "So, if we destroy the scepter, then we destroy her power," Valen finished. "But there's more. The scepter isn't just a tool of control. It's also a tether. As long as the scepter exists, the fire witch's essence is tied to it. Destroying the scepter will destroy her as well." Thorne's jaw clenched. "Then that's what we have to do." But Valen's expression darkened. "It's not that simple. The scepter is enchanted with powerful magic. It cannot be destroyed by ordinary means. We'll need a way to break the enchantment first, or we risk unleashing the full force of her power in a single moment. A heavy silence filled the cave, the weight of the task before them settling on their shoulders. Thorne looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of battle, and wondered if even they were capable of such a task. "We need to find the scepter before she does," Elyse said, her voice steady. "And we need to destroy it before it's too late." Thorne nodded, his resolve hardening once again. "Then we continue to Mount Etna. The witch won't wait forever, and neither will the volcano." As they left the cave, the heat of the world outside greeted them once more. But now, something had shifted. They had a weapon knowledge, and though the road ahead was treacherous, they knew now that there was a way to defeat the fire witch. But with every step they took toward Mount Etna, the air grew heavier, and the fire in the distance burned brighter, as though the witch herself was watching, waiting for their arrival. The race against time had begun. The path to Mount Etna grew harsher with each step, as if the mountain itself sought to repel them. The air was thick with sulfur and smoke, and the ground beneath their feet trembled with the distant rumble of molten rock. The sky, once a deep blue, had been choked by the constant plume of ash that spewed from the volcano's peak, casting the world in an eerie twilight. Thorne, Valen, and Elyse moved with caution, their eyes ever watchful. They knew they were nearing the heart of the fire witch's domain, where her power was strongest and her defenses the most dangerous. The heat was oppressive, the ground itself seeming to crackle and hiss beneath them, but they pressed on, driven by the knowledge of the scepter and the need to destroy it before the witch could reclaim her full power. As they crossed a narrow pass flanked by jagged cliffs of obsidian rock, Thorne felt the earth shift beneath him, just a slight tremor at first, but enough to send a shiver of unease through him. He motioned for the others to stop. "We're not alone," he whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. His eyes scanned the volcanic landscape, searching for the source of the disturbance. Valen's staff glowed faintly as the wizard muttered an incantation under his breath. "I sense it too," he said, his voice tense. "Something is stirring beneath the surface." Elyse crouched, her bow at the ready, her sharp gaze darting across the rocks. "There," she whispered, nodding toward a series of cracks in the ground. Thin tendrils of smoke curled up from them, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, the cracks widened, and from the depths of the earth came a sound like the roar of an inferno. The ground erupted in a shower of molten rock, and from the fissures emerged serpentine forms, massive creatures, their bodies composed entirely of molten lava. Their eyes glowed with fiery malice, and their scales shimmered with heat. Lava serpents, born of the fire deep within Mount Etna, had been unleashed. "They're guarding the path," Valen shouted as he raised his staff, summoning a barrier of shimmering light just as one of the serpents lunged forward, its jaws snapping at the air. Thorne unsheathed his sword, the blade gleaming in the hellish light. "Keep them away from Valen," he barked to Elyse, before charging toward the nearest serpent. The ground sizzled beneath its molten form as it twisted and coiled, its long body sweeping across the ground with terrifying speed. Thorne's sword met the creature's molten scales with a burst of sparks, but the heat was intense, forcing him to step back. The serpent hissed, its eyes locking onto him, and with a sudden surge, it lunged, snapping its jaws mere inches from his head. Thorne barely dodged, the heat from its breath searing the air around him. Meanwhile, Elyse had taken position on a nearby outcropping of rock. Her bow sang with deadly precision, each arrow finding its mark in the molten eyes of the serpents. One of the creatures reared back, blinded by her strike, thrashing wildly in pain. But for each serpent they felled, more seemed to emerge from the depths of the earth. The ground continued to split open, and the heat grew unbearable. Valen, his hands glowing with arcane power, chanted in an ancient language, summoning streams of water from the very air. The water collided with the serpents, sending up great clouds of steam, hissing as it cooled the molten rock. But even Valen's magic could only slow them down. "There are too many," Elyse shouted, loosing another arrow. Thorne's grip tightened on his sword, his breath ragged from the heat and exertion. The serpents were relentless, and though they fought valiantly, it was clear they were being overwhelmed. One of the creatures struck at him, its molten tail sweeping across the ground. Thorne barely managed to block it, his sword ringing with the force of the impact. Then, as if in answer to their desperate struggle, Valen's voice rang out. "The fissures! We need to close them!" Thorne understood at once. The serpents were emerging from the cracks in the earth, born from the lava flows deep below. If they could seal the fissures, they might cut off the serpent's source. "Cover me!" Valen shouted as he began weaving a new spell, his voice rising above the chaos. His staff pulsed with light as he drew power from the air around him, focusing on the largest of the fissures. Thorne and Elyse fought with renewed purpose, keeping the serpents at bay as Valen worked his magic. The wizard's face was strained with concentration, sweat pouring down his brow as the fissure began to tremble. The serpents hissed and roared, sensing the threat to their lair. With a final shout, Valen released the spell. The ground shook violently as the fissure began to close, the molten rock hardening into solid stone. The serpents, cut off from their source, writhed in fury before collapsing into piles of cooling lava, their forms disintegrating into ash. The ground stilled. The serpents were gone. Thorne sheathed his sword, breathing heavily, his heart still racing from the battle. "That was too close," he muttered. Valen, pale from the effort, nodded. "The fire witch's defenses grow stronger the closer we get." Elyse, lowering her bow, looked toward the distant peak of Mount Etna, where the plume of smoke and fire seemed to burn even brighter. "She knows we're coming." Thorne followed her gaze, his expression grim. "Then we don't have much time." Together, they pressed on, the heat of the mountain ever more oppressive as they neared the fire witch's lair. The final confrontation awaited them, and the flames of Etna burned hotter than ever. The ascent grew steeper as they neared the summit of Mount Etna, the air around them shimmering with heat, thick and suffocating. Each step felt like a trial, the ground beneath them pulsing with the energy of the molten heart that rumbled deep below. The closer they came to the fire witch's domain, the heavier the atmosphere became, as though the mountain itself sought to weigh them down, to turn them back before it was too late. At last, they reached a vast plateau, a ledge overlooking a great chasm where molten lava flowed like a river of fire. Above them, the sky was a dark, angry red, the smoke from the volcano casting everything in an eerie, blood-stained light. And there, standing on the edge of the chasm, was the fire witch herself. Isolde, as she had once been called, was no longer the woman of legend. She was more fire than flesh now, her form wrapped in flames that danced around her like a living entity. Her eyes, molten gold, burned with a fierce, unnatural light, and her hair, long and wild, shimmered like embers caught in the wind. The very air around her crackled with power, and as Thorne, Valen, and Elyse approached, the heat became almost unbearable. "At last, my visitors arrive," Isolde's voice was like the hiss of burning coals, soft yet dangerous. She did not turn to face them, her gaze fixed on the churning lava below. I wondered how long it would take you. Thorne stepped forward, sword in hand, his expression grim. We've come to stop you, Isolde. Your reign of fire ends here. Isolde laughed, a sound that echoed through the molten air. Stop me? You speak with such conviction, yet you understand so little. Slowly, she turned to face them, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the three companions. You come to challenge the power of a mountain, the very heart of fire itself. Do you truly believe you can succeed? Valen stepped forward, his staff glowing faintly. We know what you are, Isolde. We know what you once were and what you've become. Your power comes from the scepter, and without it, you are bound to this place. We will destroy it and end your tyranny. Isolde's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. The scepter? She repeated, her voice soft, dangerous. You speak of a weapon you do not understand, wizard. The scepter is more than just a tool. It is a part of me. Without it, I am diminished, yes, but it is also my tether to this world. Destroy the scepter, and you destroy me. Thorne's grip tightened on his sword. Then that's exactly what we'll do. But before he could take another step, Isolde raised a hand, and the flames around her flared. I expected more from you, Sir Thorne, she said, her voice laced with contempt. Do you not see? I am not your enemy. The power I wield could be yours as well. You have felt the touch of fire before. Let me show you how to control it. Together, we could rule this kingdom, reshape it in fire and flame. No one would dare defy you again. Her words struck Thorne like a blow, and for a moment, he faltered. Memories flashed through his mind, the fire that had taken his family, the helplessness he had felt as he watched everything he loved burn. Isolde's offer stirred something deep within him, something dark and dangerous. You've lost much to the flames, haven't you? Isolde's voice was soft now, almost gentle, but it doesn't have to be that way. With my power, you could control the fire. You could protect those you love from ever suffering the way you have. No more loss, no more pain. Elyse, sensing Thorne's hesitation, stepped forward. Don't listen to her, Thorne. She's trying to twist your mind. But Thorne's gaze remained fixed on Isolde, his thoughts warring within him. The temptation was real. He could feel it, the lure of power, of control, to never again be helpless in the face of destruction, to command the very element that had once taken everything from him. Isolde took a step closer, her molten eyes locked on his. Think of it, Thorne. The fire would be yours to command. You could protect the kingdom in ways no sword ever could. All I ask in return is your loyalty. Join me, and together we will forge a new world. The air crackled with tension, the very ground beneath them trembling with the weight of the moment. Thorne's hand wavered on the hilt of his sword, the heat of the flames swirling around him, clouding his mind. But then Valen spoke, his voice firm. Do not let her deceive you, Thorne. Power like hers comes at a cost far greater than you are willing to pay. Thorne blinked, as if awakening from a dream, and the fire in his heart dimmed. He stepped back, shaking his head, his grip tightening once more on his sword. No, he said, his voice clear and strong. I will not become like you, Isolde. Your power may be great, but it is twisted by madness. I will not trade my soul for your fire. Isolde's eyes flared with anger, her flames rising higher. Then you have chosen your fate, knight, and it will be one of ashes. The ground beneath them began to tremble violently as the fire witch summoned her full power, the the lava surging with new fury. The time for words was over. The battle had begun. The world erupted in fire. With a flick of Isolde's wrist, the molten rivers at her feet surged upward, rising like serpents of flame and ash. The heat was so intense it seemed to scorch the air itself, and the roar of the volcano echoed through the plateau as though the mountain was lending its voice to the fire witch's fury. Thorne, Valen, and Elyse barely had time to react before the first wave of flames hurtled toward them. "Scatter!" Thorne bellowed, diving to the side just as a column of molten rock slammed into the ground where he had stood. He rolled to his feet, sweat pouring down his face, his sword gleaming in the fiery light. Around him, the landscape had become a battlefield of elemental fury, where even the ground cracked and heaved beneath the weight of the witch's wrath. Elyse moved with the grace and precision of the trained archer she was, darting from one cover to the next, her eyes locked on Isolde. With swift, practiced movements, she notched an arrow and let it fly. The arrow cut through the air, a silver blur against the flames, aimed directly at the witch's heart. But before it could reach its target, the flames around Isolde flared, and the arrow disintegrated into ash, consumed by her fiery aura. Isolde smiled, her molten eyes narrowing as she focused her attention on Elyse. "Foolish girl," she hissed. "You think mortal weapons can harm me?" With a sweep of her hand, Isolde sent a wave of fire crashing toward Elyse. The archer barely had time to leap aside as the flames scorched the rock where she had been standing. The heat singed the edges of her cloak, but she was already in motion, her mind racing for a new strategy. Isolde was not just powerful, she was nearly invincible, shielded by the very element she commanded. Meanwhile, Valen stood at the edge of the battlefield, his staff raised high as he called upon the ancient magics that had been passed down through generations of wizards. His voice rose in a chant, and the air around him shimmered as water began to form, summoned from the very moisture in the air. He gestured toward the river of lava, and the water surged forward, crashing into the molten flow. Steam billowed up, a hiss like 1,000 serpents filling the air. For a moment, it seemed as though Valen's magic might hold the flames at bay, but Isolde only laughed, a terrible sound that echoed across the fiery chasm. "You cannot extinguish the fire of a mountain with mere water, wizard," she taunted, her voice carrying above the chaos. Thorne, watching the battle unfold, knew they could not win through brute force alone. His sword, though sturdy and forged in battle, would be useless against the witch's flames. And Valen, powerful though his magic was, could only hold back the fire for so long. If they were to defeat Isolde, they would need to separate her from the source of her power. His eyes darted to the witch's hand, where the scepter gleamed, its dark wood encased in a swirling aura of fire. That was the key. If he could wrest it from her grasp, they stood a chance of breaking her control over the volcano. "Elyse!" he called out, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "The scepter. We need to disarm her." Elyse understood at once, her sharp eyes following Thorne's gaze to the scepter. She nodded, her mind working quickly. "I'll distract her. Be ready." With a sharp whistle, Elyse fired another arrow, this time not at Isolde, but at the lava flow behind her. The arrow struck with precision, causing a burst of rock and molten debris to explode into the air. Isolde's attention shifted for a split second, her eyes narrowing as she turned toward the explosion. That was all Thorne needed. With a roar, he charged toward the witch, his sword raised high. The flames licked at his armor, but he did not falter. Isolde, realizing the trap too late, turned back to him, her face twisted in fury. She raised the scepter, prepared to strike him down with a torrent of fire. But before she could unleash her magic, Elyse's arrow struck true, hitting the scepter's shaft with enough force to knock it from Isolde's grasp. The scepter tumbled through the air, landing with a clatter on the rocky ground, its flames dimming as it fell from Isolde's hand. "No!" Isolde screamed, her voice filled with rage. She lunged toward the scepter, but Thorne was faster. With a mighty swing of his sword, he knocked her back, his blade cutting through the flames that surrounded her. For the first time, Isolde's defenses faltered, her fiery aura flickering like a dying flame. Valen, seeing the opportunity, raised his staff high. "Now!" he shouted, his voice ringing with authority. He slammed the staff into the ground, and a pulse of magic shot through the battlefield, aimed directly at the fallen scepter. The earth trembled as the scepter cracked, a spiderweb of fractures running along its surface. Isolde screamed, a sound of pure agony, as her connection to the scepter, her source of power, began to break. Thorne stepped forward, his sword raised for the final blow. "It ends here, Isolde." With a final, desperate cry, Isolde lashed out with her remaining power, but it was too late. Thorne's sword came down, severing her hold on the flames. The scepter shattered, and with it, the Fire Witch's control over the volcano was broken. Isolde collapsed to the ground, the flames around her extinguishing as the light faded from her molten eyes. The mountain, once alive with fire and fury, began to calm. The lava flows slowing, and the earth stilling beneath their feet. Thorne stood over the fallen witch, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his sword still glowing faintly with the heat of the battle. "It's over," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. But as the smoke cleared and the fire dimmed, Thorne knew that the final cost of their victory had yet to be revealed. The stillness that followed the shattering of the scepter was unnerving. For the first time since their journey had begun, the roar of Mount Etna subsided, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to echo in Thorne's ears. The ground, once trembling beneath the might of the volcano's fury, now lay still, its molten veins cooled and hardening underfoot. Thorne lowered his sword, the weight of the battle hanging heavily on his shoulders. Isolde lay motionless before him, her once fiery form now dimmed to little more than ash and ember. Her body, stripped of the unnatural flame that had empowered her, looked fragile, almost human once again. But Thorne knew better than to believe the battle was truly over. Valen approached slowly, his face pale from the effort of wielding such powerful magic, yet his eyes were sharp with understanding. He knelt beside Isolde's fallen form, his fingers brushing lightly over the remnants of the shattered scepter. "It's not finished," he said, his voice quiet, as though speaking too loudly might awaken something dangerous. Thorne's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "The scepter is destroyed, and with it, her power." Valen shook his head. "The scepter may be broken, but her essence is still bound to this place. She was too deeply connected to the volcano's heart, and now that bond is unraveling." He gestured toward the horizon, where faint plumes of smoke still rose from the crater. "The mountain's energy is unstable. It's only a matter of time before it erupts with more force than before. If we don't do something, the whole kingdom could be consumed." Elyse, who had been standing guard at the edge of the battlefield, stepped forward, her expression grim. "There must be a way to stop it." Valen nodded, his face grim. "There is a way, but it requires a great sacrifice." He looked to Thorne, his eyes heavy with the weight of what must be done. The scepter was not only a vessel of power, it was a conduit, binding Isolde's magic to the volcano. Now that it's broken, the only way to seal the energy is for someone to take her place, to offer themselves as the new tether. Thorne felt the weight of Valen's words settle over him like a suffocating blanket. You're saying someone has to become part of the mountain? Valen nodded slowly. To contain the fire and prevent the eruption, yes. The person who takes the bond will be tied to the volcano's energy forever. It is a fate worse than death, eternal vigilance over the molten heart of the mountain. But it's the only way. Elise's eyes widened with horror. There must be another way. This is madness. But Thorne knew in his heart that Valen was right. The magic that Isolde had wielded was too vast, too dangerous to be left unbound. The destruction they had witnessed, the lives lost to her fury, could not be allowed to continue. And as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew that he was the one who had to make the sacrifice. He had spent his life fighting to protect the kingdom, fighting against the fire that had taken everything from him. Now, in the face of that very fire, he had one final duty to perform. I'll do it, Thorne said, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. Elyse spun toward him, her eyes wide with shock. No, Thorne, you don't have to do this. We can find another way. But Thorne shook his head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his lips. There is no other way. This is what I've been fighting for all my life, to stop the fire from consuming everything. If this is the price, then I'll pay it. Valen's expression softened with understanding. You are a brave man, Thorne. The kingdom will remember your sacrifice. Elise's eyes filled with unshed tears. She took a step toward him, her hand reaching for his arm. There must be something else. You've done enough. You've given enough. Thorne placed his hand over hers, his grip firm but gentle. I have to do this, Elyse. For the kingdom. For everything we fought for. There was a moment of silence between them, filled with all the words that didn't need to be spoken. Elise's face was a mixture of sorrow and pride, her heart torn between wanting to hold him back and knowing that she couldn't. Valen stepped forward, his staff glowing softly as he prepared the ritual. This will bind you to the mountain, Thorne. Once the bond is sealed, there is no return. Thorne nodded, his heart resolute. I understand. As Valen began the incantation, the air around them shimmered with ancient magic. The ground trembled once more, but this time it was not the anger of the mountain. It was the magic, shifting, realigning itself to accommodate the new bond. Thorne stood tall, his sword sheathed at his side, his gaze fixed on the horizon as the power of the volcano surged through him. With a final word, Valen completed the spell. A wave of energy rushed through Thorne, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to blur. He could feel the pulse of the mountain, the molten fire beneath the earth, the heat of Etna's core merging with his very being. It was overwhelming, yet strangely peaceful. As the last of the magic settled, the mountain grew still. The threat of eruption was gone, the bond sealed. Thorne turned to his companions one last time, a faint smile on his lips. Take care of the kingdom, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his farewell. And with that, Sir Thorne, the knight who had faced fire and fury, became the eternal guardian of Mount Etna, bound forever to the flames he had once sought to destroy. The wind howled over the cooling slopes of Mount Etna as Valen and Elyse stood at the mountain's base, gazing up at the now silent peak. The sky had cleared, the angry red glow of fire and ash replaced by a soft, pale light that filtered through the thinning clouds. It was as if the volcano, once a roaring titan, had finally been lulled to sleep, but for Elyse, the stillness was bitter. Her eyes were fixed on the summit, her thoughts consumed with the image of Thorne, standing tall as he accepted his fate. She had known him for years, fought beside him in countless battles, and yet she had never imagined that his final battle would be one of sacrifice, one that would leave her standing in the quiet shadow of a mountain while he remained within it, forever bound to its molten heart. Valen, ever the stoic, placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression somber but resolute. His choice was not in vain, the wizard said quietly. Thorne's sacrifice has saved the kingdom. Without him, the volcano would have erupted and destroyed everything in its path. The people are safe because of him. Elyse nodded, though the words did little to ease the ache in her chest. I know, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, but it doesn't make it any easier. Valen's gaze drifted back to the peak of Mount Etna, his mind heavy with the weight of their journey. He is not truly gone, Valen said after a pause. Thorne will live on, guarding the mountain, keeping the fires at bay. The kingdom will know peace because of him. His name will be remembered, not just as a knight, but as a guardian of the land. The thought gave Elyse some comfort, though it didn't entirely erase the pain of losing him. She wiped a tear from her cheek, breathing in the cool air that now seemed so different from the fiery heat that had filled the mountain just hours ago. He gave everything, she said softly. I just wish there had been another way. There is always a cost to victory, Valen replied, his voice gentle yet firm. But know this, Thorne would not have wanted another way. He fought for this kingdom with all his heart, and in the end, he did what he believed was right. His strength came not from his sword, but from his resolve. Elyse closed her eyes, letting Valen's words sink in. She pictured Thorne as she had always known him, brave, loyal, steadfast in his duty. His face, hardened by years of battle, but always softened by a quiet determination that had guided him through every challenge. And now, that same determination had led him to the ultimate act of courage. Let us return, Valen said, breaking the silence. The king must know of Thorne's sacrifice, and the kingdom must be told of the peace he has brought. Elyse nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She mounted her horse, and together, she and Valen began the long journey back to the capital. As they rode through the charred landscape, Elyse couldn't help but notice the subtle signs of recovery. Small shoots of green pushing up through the blackened earth, the distant calls of birds returning to their scorched nests. Life was slowly returning to the land, just as Thorne's sacrifice had allowed it to. When they reached the capital, the news of Mount Etna's calming spread quickly. The people, who had lived in fear of the fire witch's wrath for weeks, now rejoiced, their hearts filled with hope once again. King Aemond himself listened to Valen and Elyse's account of the battle, his face grave as they described Thorne's final act. He gave his life for the kingdom, Elyse said, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. He chose to become the guardian of the mountain, to prevent the volcano from ever destroying the land. The king, his eyes filled with sorrow and pride, rose from his throne. Thorne will be remembered as a hero, he declared. His name will live on in the hearts of every man, woman, and child in this kingdom. A statue will be erected in his honor, and his sacrifice will be immortalized in our history. The fire of Mount Etna may be contained, but the flame of Sir Thorne's courage will never be extinguished. The court, filled with nobles and commoners alike, erupted in applause and shouts of praise for the fallen knight. But Elyse, standing quietly beside Valen, felt only a hollow ache where pride should have been. She had fought beside him for so long, and now the battle was over. But it was a victory that had come at a terrible price. Days passed, and the kingdom slowly began to heal. Villages that had been ravaged by the Fire Witch's flames were rebuilt, and the people, inspired by Thorne's story, worked tirelessly to restore the land. The statue of Sir Thorne was erected in the capital square, a towering figure of the knight, sword raised high, standing watch over the kingdom he had saved. And somewhere, deep within the heart of Mount Etna, the spirit of Thorne watched over the land as well. Bound to the volcano, he remained its eternal guardian, ensuring that the fire would never again rise to threaten the kingdom he had sworn to protect. Elyse visited the statue often, standing in its shadow and remembering the man who had given everything. Though her heart ached with the loss, she took comfort in the knowledge that Thorne had found his peace among the flames he had spent his life fighting. And in the quiet moments, when the wind whispered through the trees and the earth beneath her feet felt warm with the memory of fire, Elyse could almost feel his presence, standing watch, just as he always had.